Welcome to Flat Earth Debate Live. I'm your host, or you've not done so already, then be sure to subscribe, hit the bell notification icon and join button if you'd like to become a Nathan Oakley 1980 channel member and keep up to date with the Flat Earth Debate. If you would like to support the channel, there is a super chat that runs alongside each of these shows while they are live, and there's also a PayPal, Patreon and crypto link in the info box below the video. Also below this video you can get £50 for swapping your UK electricity supplier to Octopus Energy, and this is a particular note if you drive an electric vehicle. Most importantly, if you'd like to join the discussion, simply mute the page you are currently watching, then click the link in the info box below this video to join the panel and express your views on the nature of Earth. If you do join, please don't swear. If you do, you'll be ejected, and if you are, please don't try to rejoin the stream using sock accounts. You'll be warmly welcomed back on the next stream. Please also share the show on social media. Sharing the show obviously increases the live audience, but this in turn increases the chances of a more diverse panel, so please share the show on Facebook and Twitter. Now we are joined by 10th Man, the Adam Meakin, Arwin, Neil, Refracted Curvature, and a whole bunch of people in Discord. So welcome one and all.
Greetings all.
Hey, good morning,
everyone.
That it? Hello, good to have you all. Enthusiastic bunch that you are.
Morning, Nathan. Good to be here.
Really good. Should do a bit of housekeeping. Any evidence of a physical geometric sphere edge horizon, formerly known as Earth curvature?
It's over there in the math.
That's not evidence.
It is mathematical evidence.
All for that.
But saying it's mathematical evidence is just like saying it's right there in the words that you just used when you said Earth curve. It's like, what do you mean? Well, you said it, therefore it exists. You described it with language, therefore it exists. You described it with a mathematical language, therefore it exists. No.
Oh, and also, in the math, there is R. Just saying.
Yeah, where'd you get it in reality? When we say where'd you get R, we're not saying give us 3959 as a value. We're saying where did you measure that value in physical reality? As opposed to just tell us the number. We know the number.
I don't know. That's just what they said it was.
Let's cover that now. Any evidence of the R value?
I was going to say, this is where John, Refracted Curvature, said that the light went on for him because it was never measured. It was just math. It was never reality.
Well, if you lived on a sphere, that would make the horizon physical, and it would have to have a geometric distance from you.
That's correct. That's how the black swan stands alone as a flat Earth proof by inference. In other words, if you live on a shape, don't have to be a sphere, any shape, there's going to be a geometric limitation to your view based on that shape. Now, in the case of a sphere shape, that's a geometric limitation based on 1.2 times the square root of your observer's height in feet. Well, that distance is a geometric limitation to your view and is necessitated by living on a shape. Now, when you take away the shape and are left with an aspect, that would be a plane, then you don't have that geometric limitation anymore. So without that geometric limitation, you can't be living on any shape. You're living on a plane.
Well said.
Yeah, some people, instead of taking that, that logical route, I guess they assumed that they knew it was a ball anyway, and then devised a way to say refraction in their own minds to move it to a non-geometric position, which denies the measurement, which is insane.
Without R, you don't have a claim of Earth curve. It's an extraordinary claim in the first instance. And in order to assert it, you've got to have something in physical reality to back that you're actually on a sphere. And there isn't anything. All of their assertions start with the assumption of the R value, which they cannot measure. So the whole thing's bunk. Being on a globe's nonsense. We're on a plane. Any scientific evidence of gravity?
What is it?
It's an assertion that everything goes down at 9.8 meters per second. In the most raw form, gas debunks the assertion that we have gravity. A magical word that's used to get around all problems with the heliocentric reification.
Well, now, in Einsteinian, it's not that everything's going down at 9.8 meters per second. It's that the Earth is rising up at 9.8 meters per second. So that's not the description either. Like, they don't have a description anymore. Or the descriptions they use are nonsensical.
Well, the Einsteinian description takes place in a dimension that isn't real, so I'm not too concerned about the fourth-dimensional space-time explanation with geodesics in space-time, meaning that Earth's moving up towards your relative position at 9.8 meters per second squared. I couldn't care less. That's taking place in a fourth-dimensional place that doesn't exist. A description in maths only that doesn't apply to reality.
Well, yeah, but the Newtonian one has a R value that asserts mass attracts mass.
Yeah, they're going to need R for the centre of M2.
Would evidence for specific gravity count?
Sorry, specific gravity? What the hell is that?
Well, that's actually relative density, remember?
Is it?
Yeah, it's a measure of buoyancy. You use specific gravity when you drop a bob in your beer. You're just seeing the density change, and that tends to give you an indication as to the alcohol content, isn't it? It's just ages since I've done home brewing, but that's what it is, isn't it? It's given that title, specific gravity. But it's just talking about a differential in density, isn't it, Owen, I think?
Got a notification from the Flat Earth, Sun, Moon and Zodiac Clock app today, and it was something words to the effect of buoyancy debunking gravity. And like an idiot, I wrote to DITRH and said, you do realise that buoyancy is part of the gravity description, right? And then after I'd written it, I was like, this is an automated app that's doing things of its own volition, and the notifications have probably got sod all to do with anything DITRH is doing right this second. So this particular message is probably tied to some, I don't know, video it's publishing or publicising. And, you know, he probably read this message about buoyancy and he's like, what are you talking about? I haven't made any claim about buoyancy. But just so the flat earthers out there are aware, when you use this term, buoyancy, you're essentially opening the floodgates for them to just use that word to say, well, that's dependent on gravity. You've got to have gravity to have buoyancy. And then they beg the question of gas go down, go boom, boom.
I think you'll like this. We just typed in specific gravity, look, into Google. But what comes up?
I think this is Arwen's point, though, right?
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, you bang on, Arwen. Check it out. Can you see that, Arwen? Type in specific gravity and the description from Wiki is relative density.
But that came afloat on the table when, like, during the time we QE started rolling in, right? And we got the grip on relative density. I was confronted with ballers at that time many times, like, oh, no, you're talking about specific gravity. That's what it is. It's just part of gravity. See, gravity is in the word.
It's another scale you develop, isn't it? So if you look here, it's saying specific gravity for liquids is nearly always measured with respect to water. That's what I was saying. So it's a scale based on pure water, isn't it? So it's that's the convention. The convention is water, and you're just seeing whether it's more or less dense than water. So it really is its relationship, its relative density compared to the relative density of water is what you...
Yeah, so applicable only like gravity to liquids and solids. And if you look at the first line, relative density or highlighted specific gravity, it's the ratio of density, open brackets, mass of a unit volume over... Yeah, well, at that point you go, well, first, isn't that mole? And if you've got a gas... It's not gonna be per specific amount of volume. That's dependent on the size of the volume you give it, and then you can apply Boyle's law, right? But ultimately speaking, it's not going to be that you can just say, well, helium's going to take up a certain amount of space in a given volume. It's like, well, that's down to how much you put in, and the contrasting effect to that cause, that would be the amount of gas you put into a container, is going to be the pressure it puts on the container, as opposed to the amount per volume, or whatever it said a minute ago. So they're using it in a way because it's directly tied to gravity in this description, and applicable only to liquids and solids, right?
I've seen something mentioning air, and I was just looking for gases. The references at air temperature.
It is mentioned in there.
Yeah.
gases.
So yeah, again, look, yeah, it's different for gases because you're having to specify RTP.
But they've just
But
said,
different,
in
you
terms
can't.
of relative density, which refers back to the original sentence, which would say it was the amount per unit volume. Well, if that's the case, then how can that be applicable for 20 degrees C at room temperature, unless they're just taking it at atmospheric? That'll be mentioned. Where does it say atmosphere?
No, it doesn't. That's what I was saying. Not. It just
It
says
will.
room temperature.
But room temperature's got nothing about the amount per volume, right?
No,
And that's
not got
that's
the
not gas
pressure.
dependent either. It's volume dependent. That is equal volumes of the two substances. Volume, okay.
There you go. Must be specified for both samples and the reference, and pressure lock.
But where does that tie into the original description when it's relative density in terms of the water or solids? Suddenly the pressure's not accounted for. In other words, it's a completely different convention when dealing with gas.
Yeah, because you're having to say the temperature and pressure, which in a way is defining the volume, which is it's like when John always says, as soon as we get into discussing gases, we've got to describe them in terms of volume and pressure, not anything else. So it's harder to. But yeah, the convention doesn't flick over. Certainly not compared to this bloke here, look, testing the relative density of aviation fuel or the specific gravity of aviation fuel. Same thing.
Right, so they've transposed their specific gravity onto relative density and made it applicable in the first paragraph to only solids and liquids, and then later give you essentially a different convention to do it for gas. So it's it's not a universal convention like gravity. It's not applicable to gas. You've got to take into account different parts of a different convention, essentially changing the convention.
Yeah. Says it here, look, in British brewing, the specific gravity of a specified is multiplied by 1,000. Specific gravity is commonly used in industry as a simple means of obtaining information about the concentration of solutions of various materials, blah, 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 such as brine sugars, none of them gases. Yeah, it's not how it's. So yeah, it's liquids and specifically to know.
It's like Newton's or any other convention, man-made convention, derived and very useful when you're applying them to things that have a downward vector because they're more dense than the air that they're in.
Yeah.
Then when you get to the air that they're in, suddenly you've got to apply a completely different convention to this bastardization of relative density when described as specific gravity. Just another way of hijacking terminology that's fairly explanatory in simplistic terms, shoehorning in gravity and saying, well, this term actually means specific gravity. Does it? Why? Well, because we've got a convention for that excludes gas, and then we'll explain it away with a different convention 2 paragraphs later.
Yeah. I'll go through it and read properly, but
okay, while
you get into the volume of gas. Again, I was reading this. This is described as the most useless number in chemistry, 22.4 litres.
There it is, 1 atmosphere. Told you.
It is a useless thing because you're already defining the pressure you're putting it in. It's one of these. Yeah, I'll have a read anyway and see what.
Okay, while you're having a goosey,
later.
Any evidence that you can have gas pressure without a container?
No. And what we've just gone through specifies that, doesn't it? It's
right.
Making those statements that you have to describe it in terms of pressure. Pressure requires containment, and that's how you're going to work it out. The volume, the pressure, that's going to tell you how much you've got. That's how we measure gases.
So it's dependent on pressure to qualify it then. Go ahead, refractor curvature, and hello, Sleeping Warrior.
I was going to say, even if we lived on a sphere, we would still need a container for gas. Like even if there was an R value, you would still require containment for the gas.
Right. Specific gravity requires containment.
Yeah, and in the jargon, it's talking about atmosphere. So it's already assuming that we've got sphere-shaped air without containment in the convention when they describe gas and detail its pressure, because there's no need to get around it if you've begged the question of atmosphere, sphere-shaped air.
Yeah, I just want to point out
Right,
that the
even next
specific
to
gravity page.
space.
1 second wasted. Go ahead, Sleeping Warrior.
Yes. Specific gravity is referencing water as the reference point, but other mediums are available, like vacuums of no medium, salt water, tar, you name it. Other mediums exist, and because specific gravity pins it to that specific medium of water, it makes them think that, oh, well, we've already got that covered. Yeah, well, it makes that a fixed variable, doesn't it? It doesn't change. So, like, we do have other mediums. So once you realize that relative mediums causes relative effects, it's like a piece of the pie for relative density, but it's only limited to water. Well, relative density explains all mediums, including objects in the mediums, and it's not limited to just water. I just wanted to point that out, that other mediums are available.
Right. Relative density is a very, very simple description of how things operate. It's a subset of entropy. It's in line with natural law and what we observe. It doesn't need paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of description. It's experimentally validated. It's game over for gravity. You know, anybody out there that thinks, oh no, we'll still cling to it, and then look up things like specific gravity, read the first paragraph and think jobs are good, and unfortunately not.
And it doesn't require an electromagnetic interference to cause it either, just in case those people say that there's a little kick caused by a voltage or a current or an amperage or whatever. It doesn't need that. It's purely down to the medium relative to the object in it, and that interaction is controllable by us. You can calculate it using F equals ma, but ultimately the force that we're talking about is pressure, and that is the force that's described in Newton's first law of motion, and objects subject to pressure will accelerate. So we don't need to assume or infer gravity as the cause when we know it's pressure. Thank you.
Was that part of, or is that the main crux of Bob Nodell's presentation at Flat Toberfest?
Don't know.
I don't know either. Somebody specifically has asked me to look at some of the claims made in that particular presentation. Several people have asked me.
Well, it's the kind of thing that we should look into if we know where the link is, but I don't know. It makes me feel sick when I see people on our side pushing basically nonsense.
What would you?
So when I listen to him talking and he's pushing nonsense, it's difficult for me to focus or concentrate, because the claims he's making are all based on fallacy or based on ignorance or based on deception, essentially, and it's wrong. But he won't let anyone challenge him. So how can we counter it? The only thing we can do is keep talking about it, because that way people will get the message.
Hey, Chaos, then Riven. Hold on just 1 second, Riven. Go ahead, Chaos.
I was going to say, even like John said, even if we were on a globe, we would still need containment for the gases next to the vacuum of space. The gases are entropic, so they would disperse into into space. So even still on a globe, you'd still need a container for gas pressure. And they want to say that specific gravity, well, gravity's strong enough to keep everything down, but not gases, but it's still strong enough to keep gases in a sphere, but not strong enough still strong enough to make it so it doesn't dissipate in the space. It just all doesn't make sense anyways.
Yeah, spot on. Hold on just 1 second, Sleeping Warrior. Go ahead, Riven.
Yeah, I was going to say, what would you say? Because you say pressure is the reason that things are kind of like change, fall at a certain rate. what do you say when what gives it directionality, such as like when you've got molecules that have got an intermolecular bond that's quite strong, such as solids and liquids, they will have a down, but when they become independent
No.
and they seem to become free from the gravitational pull.
No.
But how
No,
would
no,
you
the-
characterize?
Hold on,
You
your
know, the
premise is flawed.
directionality.
Hold on, the question you're about to ask has got a flawed premise, which is why Sleeping Warrior is trying to interrupt you. Go ahead, Sleeping Warrior, just point it out and then let him carry on.
You said that. You said words to the effect of like certain gases have got a downwards something. I don't know what the word you used was, but that's not true. The thing that influences the direction is the actual thing in question, how much matter the thing's got. The word that people commonly use is mass, but mass is one of those words that's so vague and it's lacking definition from all parts of physics. It becomes more of a belief or a religion element to it than it is an actual physicality. But essentially, mass is the thing that we like. The difference between a ping pong ball and a golf ball, they're both pretty much the same size, yet one's significantly heavier. Well, it's that attribute of matter that is what we call weight. All right, so two objects have got different weight, and because they've got different attributes, they behave differently when they're interacting with each other. And Einstein argues that when you've got two masses or two weights, because mass and energy are interchangeable, the golf ball has got more mass energy than what the ping pong ball has. So that's able to do more because it's able to convert more of that mass or energy into other forms of energy. So when you have them competing for the same space because they're in the same medium and they're moving around because they're in water, for example, there's a relationship there. There's an interaction. There's something happening. Now, we can argue all day about the interpretation, but the fact remains that the interaction we can observe, and we know that it's caused by pressure because we can manipulate that pressure by adding and changing the medium and stuff, relative density, right? We know that's what's causing the acceleration. So when you say that there was a downwards something, it's not true. What you're describing is a perception of something going down, but it's based on how much matter is in the thing that's in question, that's interacting with its medium.
I wasn't saying it about gases. I did say liquids and solids. I said, the ones that seem to have more bonds, the masses or the little on a microscopic level, the little bonds between the what was you talking about? The matter. Like the more they seem to be together, the more they group up, the more that effect you seem to have seems to be more of a downward effect. Not gases. Obviously, they're omnidirectional.
Not
they seem
downward.
to be dependent.
Not
Never said
downward.
downward gases. Never did say.
Hold on,
downward
just one second. Just one sec. While he's replying, Riven, can you go on mute? Because all we're hearing is your background noise coming through because you're just remaining off mute while he's talking. Thanks.
Not down. What you're perceiving as down is actually more mass, more matter, more weight, more whatever that attribute of matter is. You're perceiving that as that increases, it gains a directionality to it. But you're ignoring that the directionality is relative to the medium it's in. So if you were to change the media, as you gain matter with more intermolecular bonding, that creates more matter, and the globule that you're creating gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The mass is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, isn't it? The weight, the object, that attribute of matter is getting bigger. So you perceive that to be down. But what's actually happening is relative to the medium it's in, it's gaining more weight, matter, mass, energy. So that attribute of matter that we're describing, when you pin down to it, what you need to replace is the word down, change that to more matter, more mass, more whatever, because that's really relative to its medium. And then it makes sense.
Well, hold on a sec. What about an anvil floating on Mercury? Because that anvil's going up relative to the Mercury.
So Brian would say there's more structural support from the Mercury than there is from the anvil, and he's right. But I don't like the word structural support. I just say that the anvil's got more density, less density than the medium it's trying to sit in, right? It can't get into the medium of the Mercury because the Mercury is more dense than it. So the structural support that Brian refers to is essentially it's the more dense medium is displacing the anvil because it appears to be lighter than it. It's got less matter, but that's not up. So we wouldn't say that the anvil's going up. We would say that the anvil is less dense. So you can conflate, you can replace completely up and down with more dense and less dense to describe the interaction. And then that removes completely the up and down perception that we perceive because it's us that perceives it. Well, remove the human and the anvil is still being pushed up, isn't it, relative to the medium? But there's no longer a human there to describe that behavior. So you wouldn't describe it with the words up and down because there's no human there to relate it to. So you would have to say it's displacing its medium either because it's more dense or less dense. So you can see where the words up and down come from. It comes from the human describing what that person sees, which is why if you're upside down.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I think that's well said.
Does gas have matter? Does gas have matter? Would you qualify that?
Yeah, gas molecules have all got so you can look at the atomic weight number for mass for gas particles, and you can observe that hydrogen's first, and then helium, and then like oxygen and nitrogen are down towards 7 and 8, and then you get more dense gases. You've got then relativity, right? You've got an interaction relative to all of the gas molecules, and if they're all moving round, the gradient that would form would be based on the atomic number. And it's based on the amount of matter that the molecules have. So you'll have a skinny molecule, you'll have a medium molecule, and you'll have a fat molecule. And you can tell that the fat molecules are going to bounce the skinny ones away. And that's where we get the gradient from. Then they call that gravity. But what it is, it's the heavier molecules are moving slower. The little molecules, the skinny molecules, are being bounced away from them. And because they've got more matter to them, they've got more mass, they've got more whatever that word you want to use to describe it, it's just when fat man's bouncing little man away. Stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, all the words to describe these are all flawed in some way, right? So, you can use mass, but then you find it's equivocated with inertia and mole. The two descriptions are simultaneously used for the same thing. So then you use mole, and how can you apply that when you've got something that's expanding to fill the amount of space it's got? Well, you can't. So you end up sort of having to dumb it down to just try and get out the words that you're using to describe what Anthony's just describing. It's just, well, how much stuff is it comprised of as an individual entity? Is it more stuff or less stuff? Because that's what we mean when we say density. How dense is it?
So Quantum Eraser describes this as a dichotomy. He says that mass and mole are basically, it's two explanations for the same word. And it's actually a trichotomy, because Einstein says, well, mass and energy are interchangeable. So as mass increases, energy increases too. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Einstein isn't the point. The point that Einstein's making now is that you've got mole, you've got mass, and now you've got energy as well. E equals mc squared. So the energy is equal to the amount of mass, and then multiplied by the constant for light squared, but we're not going to talk about the light. The point is that he's conflating energy with mass. So you've no longer got just mass and mole. You've got mass, mole, and energy all describing the same attribute of matter that we don't know what really to call it, but we generally use the word mass. But the minute you use the word mass in a general term to describe what you're talking about, instantly it starts unlocking all these formulas and stuff. And the rumpus will come in and start calculating things, and there'll always be a little G in there somewhere or an R in there somewhere. But in real world, you've just got a relative reaction between ping pong ball and golf ball with the medium it's in. And you don't need to get into all these conventions. Just understand that they're obfuscated to death to try and get you into the trap of calculating into existence these forces that they want you to believe. And the reality is, whatever the difference is between a ping pong ball and a golf ball, call it whatever you want, but it interacts with its medium. So how do we explain that? Well, it's fraught with minds, and you're walking through a minefield. But the reality is, in simple terms, there's a reaction, an interaction with the object and the medium it's in, and you can call it relative density because it's simple, it's self-explanatory. Everybody understands what it means, and we get the directionality from the human. That's the key thing to understand.
I like
Anthony.
there.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for, Nathan. That's what I was looking for. Directionality from the human. That's where we get it from. Because that's the question I always get asked. Where does density doesn't give directionality? And it's a good argument from the Globers, I guess I would say, because they're trying to point out a point that the density of the object isn't what's giving it the directionality. But now you've said it well. It comes from the person, right? The person who's objectifying it, who's looking at it. They're the one who's determining an up and down, when really it's just reacting. But the reaction does seem to be, from what we can see, a horizontal behavior pattern. It's rather up or down.
You mean
Adam, you want to go?
No, you're missing the key word, right? It's relative. So there is no absolute down, there is no absolute up. You can't have up without down. It's relative. So in this case, for something to be going up, you've got something else going down in terms of their description with gravity and buoyancy. Whereas Anthony's saying, no, it's purely dependent on the density. And the direction it moves isn't an absolute. It's not going to move down. If you've got, I don't know, milk, paint thinners and honey, when you mix it all together, some of them are going to have a downward direction. Some of them are going to have an upward direction as they reach equilibrium. And ultimately, at the end of the process, you're going to have exactly that, just an equilibrium between these densities. But the vector that's only going to be induced typically because somebody's messed with something, yeah? Typically, things are in equilibrium in that regard. You know, when you're looking at liquids or solids, things aren't falling down. When people say this nonsense, well, stuff falls down. No, some stuff falls down, having, in the case of rain, gone up first in the form of gas. That's a cycle. So you've got stuff going up and then down and up, and it's not just going down. And as for the stuff around me, like pens and microphones, I don't tend to observe many microphones falling down or pens falling down unless I drop them or knock them off from where I put them up in the first place. So this whole notion is flawed, but it's only there to introduce a bias downwards, a direction that's absolute, when it's all relative, hence the description relative density. So every time you ask, well, what about the down bit? Why is there a bias? Well, there isn't. What are you talking about? What bias?
Yeah, change the
There's a
word down
relationship
to
between
more.
Like
everything that's an opposite in reaction, right? So
Hold on,
it's just the opposite to. There's only seems to have a horizontal behavior pattern. There's only things that like you said, not all stuff goes down, but all stuff goes up or down. It's only that between them two categories. I think it's an up and down relationship, an opposite. Like
Just
it's not we give it a direction, but it's still.
There's a false
the opposite.
dichotomy, isn't it?
You don't get a you don't get a diagonal, do you?
3 people
There's a
talking. Can you
false
not hear
dichotomy.
Riven talking, guys, in the G+? Can you not hear him? Because you're talking straight through him. There's 3 people talking over the top of his conclusion.
the way to get round
Yeah,
it, Riven, is to
because there's not
change the word up and
diagonal
down.
sort of relationship.
Oh
but there's
my
no,
god. Let's try that once more. Can you not hear Riven talking?
Check.
Go on, Riven.
Right, number 1,
Mike.
you're just... Hold on. You're distorting, Riven. So, because they're ignoring you, you've decided to turn your mic up. So now you're clipping your mic, which is annoying me.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Right? Just rely on me to get control of them. Don't just turn yourself up. It's really irritating because you're just distorting. Okay, fine. Right. Can everyone in G+ just let Riven get to the end of his point? He's tried 3 times.
I'm trying to get in also, so when
I know. I'm well aware, Eli. Thank you.
Sorry, Eli. In a quick way of putting what I was saying into is basically, even though we give it a directionality by down, I said that the opposite reaction between the behavior of the mass or however you want to quantify it, it doesn't seem to have any diagonal sort of. There's no like an opposite diagonal. It just seems to be an up and down horizontal relationship. Not saying that stuff goes down, just saying things that do go up and down, but it only seems to be within that category. So because it doesn't go diagonal in any other direction, I think that's the determination between the reactions between the golf ball and the ping pong ball. It only seems to these reactions do seem to be an upward downwards relationship. That's the point I was making out.
Hey, Sleeping Warrior, this was originally your conversation with him, so if you want to round out your points with him, and then we'll move to Eli. And say
The
hello to
bottom
Brian,
line is
etc.
just change the direction words up and down to more dense and less dense relative to each other, and then you've got your directionality. You don't need the human, because obviously these things are still moving when the human's not looking at them. So if he's not looking at them, he's not there, he's dead or whatever. How would you describe it if there's no human there to make reference to? Because my left is your right. Well, you change the words up and down for more and less dense, and then there is no direction anymore. There's no issue there. So the answer is why down? Well, because you've called it that. The real direction is more dense or less dense. That's it.
Okay, Eli, go ahead.
okay, I see the overall arguing point. It's not really too important. But
Breaking up, Eli, you're roboting. Can't
if
hear
we're
you.
talking about
Try that once more, Eli. You're
All right.
roboting. Or just go on mute completely. Anybody else was trying to get in while Eli figures out what's going on? I think he's just in the dead zone.
Something, but Adam was before me.
Adam, go ahead.
It was just a mild note, as Anthony was describing. I gave him a round of applause. Atomic weight. When I were a lad, it was atomic weight. And I think if we stick with the convention of weight, certainly it doesn't upset any of my chemistry, because when I'm making things, I weigh out my ingredients I use the convention of weight. It works perfectly well in molecular theory for me as well. I don't need to use the word mass, and I just wanted to give Anthony a shout out there. It was noted, and it does save a lot of fliff flaff and need it. You can use atomic weight, I think, quite happily within the convention.
All right. Yeah, I think what Anthony just did was beautiful because he basically said, at least the way I took it, if you don't presuppose anything and just study nature, you're not going to come up with gravity the way the ballers do. They have a presupposition they have to somehow prove, even if it's mathematically and no other way. So they're always going to try to make it fit a sphere that doesn't exist, revolving around and all this stuff, and gas pressure without containment. So on all fronts, they die in their arguments to defend the sphere. They don't even have an R. So of course, they're going to use these words in the presupposition that they already have. So they're coming into it with a bias and trying to prove that bias. Whereas if you just say, look, I don't know what the shape of the earth is, but this is what this is, you're never going to come up with what they say. You're never going to come up with gravity if you start there. That's it.
Well, it seems to me like they're asserting a cause for this proportionality we observe, right? That's what it all comes down to. They're asserting a cause for entropy almost. Well, I guess that's what they're doing. They're trying to say that this effect of relative density that we see is caused by gravity.
Yes, it's the start. Yes, it's the start of their origin story, isn't it?
Right. So they're they're asserting a cause for something that we know that nobody knows the cause of it.
Correct. When we discussed what is relative density and ergo trying to establish the cause of it, you get down to the nitty-gritty of what you're describing, and it's a second-order effect of entropy. Ergo, when you insert gravity, you're trying to explain it away in the origin story as the basic cause of everything. It's the beginning of their story. That's what starts the process going in their world. So that's their god.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So what I was going to say earlier, I was thinking it wasn't such a strong point, but now I'm thinking it is. Because honestly, when it comes to gravity, they want us to think in terms of one direction down, and then us as flat earthers say, well, what about up? But I think that's a false dichotomy, because when it comes to the makeup of everything that's in existence from a heliocentric standpoint, gravity has pulled all of this gas together, and then somehow, all the rest of the matter came to be, the earth and the other physical things. But everything was in a gaseous state, right? And so when we're talking about gas, it doesn't just go up or down, it goes everywhere. You have clouds that move laterally, you have, even on water, you have water flowing laterally. It's not just up and down, but they'd like to at least get us to fight about just up and down when it's even more absurd than they try to make it seem. There's a lot more to the reality than just assuming there's a universal down.
All vectors.
And Tony said this one day. I liked when he said it. I never forgot.
Said what?
When he was saying there's lateral displacement also, because you don't just say pour water into a bucket and then it just fills up in a column. It displaces laterally first, all of the area, and then goes up.
Yeah, you don't fill a bucket up with vertical strips of water. You pour the liquid in, it hits the deck, it spreads out laterally first, and then it starts to rise once it hits the walls of its container. Only then will it start to rise. Well, that's lateral first, isn't it? Another example would be like in the biogeochemical cycle, where you see water evaporating in the hydrological cycle. that gas pressure that's being released from the surface water burning off and breaking that hydrogen bond, some of it goes up, but some of it goes laterally as well. It goes in all directions. And that lateral movement of molecules, water vapor or whatever gases they are, we call that wind. And that wind will always try and find equilibrium with lower pressure. That's why high pressure goes to lower pressure. And we utilize that lateral displacement of air in offshore wind farms, turbines that generate electricity. So there is examples of lateral displacement. It's just ignorant to say that there's not, but they like to say that because they don't want it to be true.
If anyone's ever played golf, I'll be quick, Brian. If anyone's played golf, it's always played laterally. Slice, hook, slice. Oh, okay, I'm on the green now.
You didn't have to rush into it. It was okay. We just came in at the same time. I wouldn't say gas moves laterally. I just say gas moves in all directions. Liquid, like in a bucket, has to spread out laterally because you can weigh a drop of rain, a drop of water. You can weigh a drop of water, and drops only get so big because of air, because of the density of air, that they fall through. You can weigh a drop of water because a drop of water will always have a singular downward vector. You can't weigh gas in its natural state. You can't do that.
This is your structural support moment, Bri.
I don't want to hijack everything that's been said. Yeah, I know, but I don't want to hijack everything that's been said.
No, this is where it makes a good point, your structural support, when we talk about the behavior of liquids and why there is a lateral movement and not. Yeah, it is that weak structural support that a liquid has compared to a solid that means it will distribute laterally first, because there isn't sufficient structural support. If you put a bit more water on top of the water, there isn't structural support enough if there's lateral movement is available. It's only when the lateral movement is impeded that the structural support is sufficient to add to the upwards increase. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, because if you think about the pressure at the bottom of a bucket of water, or the bottom of a lake or an ocean, the pressure increases because there is a singular downward weight. There's a singular downward vector to water. So the pressure increases. Now, I know you have lateral pressure there as well, because it's pressing in on all sides, but the weight, the water, whatever weight it has like weight, what's that? It's anything that will fall through gas, isn't it? Weight is anything that will fall through gas you can weigh. Anything you can weigh in its natural state is something that will fall through gas in its natural state. But you can't weigh gas in its natural state. You have to put it in a container, and then you're just weighing a container that has a greater volume of density, or whatever, a greater amount of density to it. You're adding to the density of the container. That's really all you're doing. You still don't have a singular downward vector inside that container. It's just that the gas is in, and you can't even say with the gases in the container you can't even say that that's definitely the weight of the gas. All you can say is that's the weight of that the contained gas will give you. But there still isn't a singular downward vector inside in it. So it's, it swings and roundabouts, isn't it? It's like, how do you weigh gas? If it's in this gaseous state, I don't care if it's CO2, I don't care if it's man-made sulfur hexafluoride, it still has vectors in all directions. You can't weigh a gas in its gaseous state. Can't do it. It has to be liquefied, put it in a container, and even at that, you don't even know if you're getting a full weight. Do you really? You just have to go with whatever you get.
Yeah, that's why we have the convention of pressure.
Right. It's measured in gas pressure, not gas weight.
I don't like the word convention of pressure. Pressure is a force. It causes objects to move, like tire pressure. Pressure is a force, right? So when we see things moving, pressure is never really considered because people can't see the pressure, right? They can't see the impact, the interaction, the thing that's doing the observation. But we know pressure exists because we know that tires, when they go low with pressure, they can't sustain the weight of the car anymore and you get a flat tire. You can't see that interaction, but it does exist and it is a cause of acceleration.
I don't know if I agree with that because force would be pressure over an area. Pressure is part of the force equation. So it
Yeah,
can't
but
be a
pressure-
force
So
itself.
pressure could cause weight. Couldn't pressure cause weight then as well?
Be
So
careful
the
with
force would technically also be weight and pressure.
Yeah, be careful with using their terminology because a lot of it's deliberately it's confusing because they want to trap you inside their convention, right? The reality is the force of pressure is the thing that accelerates objects, right? Now, when they define it as, well, pressure equals force over area, yeah, you do need the area because that needs to be pushing against the thing to give you the pressure. But that doesn't mean that pressure itself isn't a force. It is, because tire pressure is a thing, right? It keeps your car running.
Well, wouldn't it be the entropy of the air causing the pressure? The particles
No, it would be the
going in all
amount of
directions.
air. Be the amount of air bouncing off the molecules bouncing off the inside of the tire carcass, and the more molecules are colliding, the more pressure. You've got to put more and more in there to be able to create the pressure.
Right. So the pressure is just like the air particles are causing the pressure, right?
The collisions with the container. It needs to have air molecules and collisions with the container, isn't it? Not just air molecules.
Right. But that's what's causing the pressure is the air molecules colliding with the area.
Yeah, and as the molecules hit the tire wall, and there is a force at that moment, that impact, that force there, because we can't see it, because it's basically gases are mainly invisible. We know the gases do exist, we can light them and all that, so we know the gases are there, whatever form they're in, however they present themselves, we know they are there, and we know that they are interacting with the walls of the container, and we can measure that effect, and we can utilize that effect. But a lot of people don't realize or forget that pressure is a force. So be careful with the terminology, but don't be a fool. If you think pressure might not be a thing or whatever, stand next to a tire when it blows up and you'll feel the pressure.
A couple of quick shout outs to people who've super chatted while you've been chatting away. One is test message, winky face from Gourdzilla. I think he's checking to see if I'll actually read out his messages or not. Thank you very much indeed for the super chat there, Gourdzilla. And a Unicorn Laser Eyes, who says, Bob the Sci-Fi Guy is in Discord chat saying, once a brick stops, it's still accelerating. Lol. Thank you very much indeed for the super chat, both of you. Really appreciate the support.
So when a brick stops,
well, I suppose technically you could argue that the brick will still be under Brownian motion, perhaps. I'm not sure. We need a little bit more elaboration, but I think Bob's going to be turning things that are stationary into things that are moving, because he'll just say that, well, from the inertial frame of reference.
the accelerating.
If you take away,
coffee.
sorry, John.
Oh no, it just reminds me of that guy saying that his coffee cup was accelerating.
That would be Moisty.
RC Moisty, yeah. Well, Bob actually has a point, right? In as much as if you take away the support underneath the brick, the reason that the brick stops falling, if you take that away, it will start to accelerate. So there was always a singular downward vector with the brick.
What medium's the brick in?
Well, it's surrounded by air.
All right. Well,
But
then
if you
in
move
that
the
case, the
table
brick is
away-
more dense than the air.
You move the support away, you've set up, not by lifting, but what you've set up is another disequilibrium that will need to be played out. All you've done.
Correct.
Then Einstein would then argue that the energy that the brick has, the mass and energy, because he says they're the same thing. He says the mass of the brick, or the energy of the brick, is greater than the mass or the energy of the air. So that then is converted into kinetic energy because you've removed something out of the. But it's relative density, guys. It's literally E equals mc squared is relative density on Earth. It's
Einstein's explanation takes place with a bending geodesic in space-time, though, doesn't it, Anthony?
I know, but he's describing in Narnia. He's describing what we see in the real world.
Sorry, in Narnia, he's describing what we see in the real world. Well, we don't live in Narnia, and descriptions of what takes place in fourth-dimensional bending pseudo-force space aren't applicable to the real world we experience.
I know. You are right to keep pointing that out.
Well, when you say energy and mass are interchangeable, that's a problem too. because
whoa,
neither
whoa,
one of those words are defined.
I'm not saying that. I'm just repeating Einstein's words in his equation E equals mc squared. I'm not saying that. They're his words, not mine. Don't ascribe them to me.
Okay, yeah. Well, if Einstein believed that and didn't define the words, then it's the same as saying Snurflegurks are equal to Jabba-hoots. It's just nonsense.
What was the point here? A brick is moving when it's not moving? Is that the point?
Yeah, we've got a few.
I think.
Go on, Brian.
I was just going to say it comes down to we're talking about different descriptions for the same effect, right? It all comes down to what is the most honest description, because that would be the most correct. So what is the most honest description? Is the most honest description that mass and energy are interchangeable? Not for that effect. Is it that the brick is still accelerating when it's on the ground? No, because that's not something you can support. All you can support is that when you lift it off the ground, it will fall back down to it. The most honest description is relative density.
So Brian,
with this, Tony or Brian, the reason that they're saying it's accelerating and has to be accelerating is, in my way of thinking, is to support the mathematics, because the way in which they describe an object's weight is mass times acceleration. Now, if it's not accelerating, that ruins the maths, doesn't it? Because the second it stops accelerating, by their definition, the weight equals 0 because it's no longer accelerating, because they require weight, the convention of weight, to be defined by mass times acceleration. So that's why they have to describe a static coffee cup as accelerating to it and attribute the 9.8 to it, even though it's not. Yeah.
Let's not shorten the definition for weight. So when we say weight is mass times the acceleration, don't chop off that end bit due to gravity, because that's really important, because we know that gravity is not a force. We know that it's simply an effect. But if you're going to multiply a mass by an acceleration due to gravity, then it's a nonsense, because if you multiply something, mass, by a 0 value, then you end up with a 0 value. So let's not abbreviate it to because it's devastating to their arguments. They're applying a Newtonian convention to a calculation which Einstein superseded and essentially made that 0, because you can't multiply by a 0 and get anything positive from it. But you're right. I think what he might be referring to is when there's an object sat on something and it's exerting a force, that doesn't mean it's accelerating. I think what he's referring to is when he says, well, from the inertial frame of reference, and then starts talking about woo-woo land. But it could be either. But let's just not shorten that definition for weight, because we always get criticized for not knowing the science, right? But if we cite the science back to them, it becomes nonsense. So weight's one of those things that's always a 0 value, because you can't multiply by an acceleration due to gravity if gravity is not a force, because it can't accelerate matter. So it's always 0.
Sorry, thank you. Go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'll go after you. The point I make would be made.
All right, Adam, you just demonstrated what I think I said earlier perfectly there. Because they have a presupposition of gravity, they have to say the way you described they're saying it mathematically. But if they wouldn't have that presupposition, then that coffee cup is at rest. It's not accelerating. But because they have a presupposition of gravity, it is accelerating. But it's not accelerating, if you get my point.
That seems to be the issue, that as a layman you look at it and having to make the claim that it's still accelerating even though it's static, and the only reason is, like I say, to be able to put a value in that isn't 0.
Right. They move the value to 1, so you've got 1g.
This is exactly what I was going to talk about. But if you have more to say on it, Nathan, I'll wait till you're finished. I don't know if you're finished saying that or not.
Go ahead, Adam. I'm hijacking your point, and Brian wants to make the same point. So go ahead, Adam.
My point was to ask people who know this better for clarity on Tony and Brian. So off you go, Brian.
Thanks, Adam. I don't know if I know it better. I'm just trying to just pointing out something that the ballers have claimed for years that I pulled them on. They claim, and Einstein was the same, they always talk about objects in free fall, and they claim an object in free fall, right, is weightless, right? But if it's falling, it has weight. Gas is not falling. Gas does move in cycles with convection and different things like that, but it's not falling, it's moving in all directions. So anything that's falling does have weight, because if it was weightless, it wouldn't be falling. And that's where, this is the thing, where whether it's gravity as a force or whether it's Einstein, they're always talking about the object in free fall. Free fall is the part, right? It's falling, which means it has to have weight to fall, because anything with weight has a singular downward vector. And what's it falling through? The medium of air. So that's the little trick they have. It's the trick they play on themselves. They have it in their own head. Free-falling objects are weightless. No, free-falling objects have weight. That's why they're falling. It's, as I said, the most honest description. I'm finished.
So, Anthony, are you still around? Oh, go ahead, Refracted Curvature. You've been trying to get in a few times. My bad.
I was just going to say that I think one of the problems in discussing this subject is we're using their conventions to discuss the topic, and their conventions are based around an R value that's been debunked. So it's really hard to communicate these ideas when gravity keeps getting thrown in, even though that has a radius value to Earth.
Let's take this back to Nathan's original point that this came back from. Nathan's original point was you realize that buoyancy is it's a function of gravity. You need gravity in the mass for buoyancy to work. Well, we're using their terms. That's why at the end of the day, we needed a term to describe something that wasn't using terms like gravity or buoyancy, right? And I needed to think of something that made sense. You can't call the Egg's acceleration anything to do with specific gravity, because instantly you're thinking gravity to do with the Earth, right? So all I did was I just looked at, well, what is going on here? It's like, say what you see. It was like catchphrase, say what you see. And what I was seeing was a relative density change, something to do, and that's where it came from. And me and Arwin battered over this for a few months. We were arguing over the terminology. We were saying the same thing, but we didn't have the words to do it. And your point is valid. We're using their terminology to describe stuff. Now, it's not great to put our own terminology on it because it confuses things when there's too much of it. But the reality is we can explain the observations that we see in the day-to-day, the real world day-to-day, and it's got nothing to do with gravity. You're right.
Hold on.
Before Arwin just pipes
You're
in.
referencing me and what we did. It took a long time before we came to terms, right? Because I did hang on to a non-scientific understanding of gravity as a concept for a very long time. But once I relinquished that and admitted it's an aberration, dude, we got along perfectly. We were like totally on the same. You were actually kind of disappointed that I stopped resisting you.
Okay, thank you.
But the thing,
remember correctly.
the point I was making was that the terminology didn't exist, and we were arguing the same point, but without the language to do it. And once we realized that we were killing each other, but because it was purely down on language, then all of a sudden it was like, hang on, the issue is language here. It's not to do with communication. It's not to do with knowledge or intellect. It's to do with the words that we're using within their convention. They need to be changed.
Okay, Anthony.
Right, but we were all digging around. All of us.
My fifth attempt on my own show. Well, try once more. Anthony. So if somebody was to assert that gravity is a force and then used F equals ma to justify it, what would be your reaction?
Well, gravity is not a force in current physics. It's defined by Einstein in 1915 as an effect. And if you calculate the force using F equals ma, you are using Newton's second law of motion as a substitute in lieu of addressing his first law of motion, which states that a force is needed to accelerate matter. Not a calculation, not a sum, not anything. You've got to have a force to accelerate matter, applying Newton's first law of motion. And what they're doing is calculating the force with mass times the acceleration due to gravity, which is always zero because gravity is not a force. And then that calculation becomes a substitution for having the force in the first place. Well, Newton's first law doesn't allow you to substitute. He says it's got to be a force, not the result of a calculation. So no, you can't calculate forces into existence. You've got to demonstrate what the force is to get the acceleration, not calculate the force and assume that it's gravity.
Ask me the same question, Nathan.
Forgotten what question I asked. I asked about F equals ma, didn't I? My bad. It was actually from the chat, so it's Unicorn Laser Eyes. So if I was to assert that gravity is a force and my justification was F equals ma, what would be your reaction, Brian?
Objects weigh more in a vacuum, so that's the end of that. There is no more claim of a force after that, because a force of gravity would mean F equals ma. When they speak about that, they're speaking about the air having mass, which means the air has to be being accelerated downward in a singular downward vector, giving more weight to objects. So in a vacuum,
what Brian's just done there is he's sorry.
Just leave me finish what I'm saying, and I'll be quick. In a vacuum, objects have to weigh less under a force of gravity, but they weigh more, debunking that it exists. Now, Anthony.
So what Brian's just done there is given the flat Earth explanation for why. But what I was doing was giving using their science against them explanation, because they're substituting mathematics for forces. You can't calculate forces into existence. It violates Newton's first law of motion. If you spit that back to them, they don't like it.
Yeah, I wasn't going to be in competition with Anthony.
Okay, what if,
I
what
was
if
just
that...
giving it
Sorry, Brian, what if that justification was being
that.
used outside the realms of heliocentric gravity, was being used in terms of incoherent dielectric acceleration, and then you asserted F equals ma?
Sorry, Nathan. Ask that again.
Are you talking to me or Anthony?
Anybody who wants to take up this subject.
Well, that wouldn't make any difference. You're still claiming air has mass, and you're claiming that there's a force causing a singular downward acceleration.
What was the question, Nathan?
Again, chat, guys.
The question is, Anthony, if I assert that gravity is a force, and then I justify what that force is with incoherent dielectric acceleration, and justify it with F equals ma, what would be your reaction?
It'd be the same. All you're doing is you're substituting the mathematics for a force that, without demonstrating that the force actually exists. You can't calculate forces into existence just by F equals ma. You've got to demonstrate it, which is why I did my test recently.
Hold on, you haven't taken something into account. I'm assuming a downward bias, Anthony. What's your problem?
Well, then you're reifying, aren't you? You've got to still demonstrate it.
No, things go down.
Yeah, that's begging the question, and you're reifying it with mathematics.
Can I ask Brian something?
Yeah.
Off you go.
It's very crowded here. No problem, by the way. It's a great show so far. But I was wondering about this, what you said, that objects should fall slower in a vacuum. Is that based on the idea of a Newtonian model?
Not what he said.
Basically.
No, that's not what I said. Objects should, under a force of gravity, objects should weigh less in a vacuum, but they actually weigh more. And the reason they weigh more is because air gives a certain amount of, I call it support, they claim buoyancy, which is not weight. Do you know what I mean? Buoyancy is not weight. You know,
right.
That's not a singular, so it gives a certain amount of support. So when you take that little bit of support away, that little bit of lift, the objects weigh more in a vacuum, whereas it shouldn't do under a force of gravity.
Yeah, I understand now, but I kind of sort of philosophically disagree where both, like, what if it were and it isn't, right? So I think that it really doesn't matter. Like, it shouldn't fall faster, way more. It shouldn't be any different in a vacuum versus filled around with gas, because like, it's only about the preponderance, the virtual center point of all the masses pulling on it, not its direct surrounding. Like, the gas would at best like just slow it down a little in its being pulled towards the virtual center. So I always thought that in the Newtonian model, it doesn't really matter what it's surrounded by. Only the proximity to the virtual center of gravity is the thing that matters for its strength. What do you think about that?
I'll tell you why it matters, because they claim a weight to air for their pressure gradient, their air pressure gradient. They have to claim there's a weight to air. Air has mass, gas has mass, and that gravity gives it weight, which creates a pressure gradient. And they also have to, and they do officially claim that all the gases start to layer via density when you go up really high, but that's higher than any of us can go. You have to be an acid to go up that high. So their claim is weight to air for their pressure gradient.
Gas go down, go
How
boom,
much
boom.
weight they
But
are.
how would that change if you drew a vacuum around it? See, because it's
Well,
more about the distance to Earth.
It's like the weight of water on top. It's like the water on top of you. It's like the weight of water on top of you. That downward pressure. It'd be that. You take away the water, you wouldn't have as much weight.
Gas go
Same thing
down, go
with
boom,
air.
boom. Anyway, Adam's
Yeah,
been
but-
waiting in the wings. Sorry, I had to cut you off, Arwin. But we can talk about gas go down, go boom, boom for the next 10 minutes. But Adam, do you want to just read out your quote? There's a few quotes flying by in the chat as well. Thank you, everyone who's been participating in the chat. I really appreciate it. But Adam, did you want to read this out?
I want to give a shout out to the chat. It's from Explain How. So I looked up the quote that they've stated in. It's a bit fuller, but yeah, I'll just read it. So this is from Henri Poincaré, I would imagine, or Henri Poincaré. When we say force is the cause of motion, we talk metaphysics. And this definition, if one were content with it, would be absolutely sterile. For a definition to be of any use, it must teach us to measure force. Moreover, that suffices. It is not at all necessary that it teaches what force is in itself, nor whether it is the cause or the effect of motion. Not sure what to make of that, but that's from 1897, I think.
Well,
I think
that
we
seems
put-
to be directly contradicting Newton's first law of motion.
The laws of motion of Newton were not right. With that, I'm going to say, if you are watching this on either Nathan Oakley 1980 or Nathan Oakley Premiering streams, then stay tuned, as there will be an after show to follow. Unfortunately, if you are watching this live, this is where we bid you farewell. So, a huge, massive, enormous thank you to all of you who smashed the super chat, liked, commented, shared, subscribed, or joined as a Nathan Oakley 1980 channel member. Speaking of Nathan Oakley 1980 channel members, I'm intending to run this show a little bit longer every now and again after the live show finishes for members only, so be sure to check that out if you are a member, or join as a member if you'd like to be a reciprocant of that feature. Once again, stay tuned if you're watching on either Premiering stream. I've been Nathan Oakley, and I will see you all in the next video.
What a lovely day!